Good afternoon and welcome to this Euractiv virtual conference supported by 5GAA on reducing EU transport emissions. Can C-V2X deployment play a significant role? The European Commission is currently working on a comprehensive strategy for sustainable and smart mobility as part of the European Green Deal. It's scheduled for release before the end of 2020. The strategy intends to propose matching measures to the ambition to achieve a 90% reduction in emissions by 2050. In pursuing this goal, policymakers intend to leverage digitalisation and automation, enhancing connectivity to the next level. And last but not least, it will ensure safety and accessibility. Researchers are currently working to identify and assess the most promising benefits of cellular vehicle-to-everything functionalities that could contribute to reaching Europe's ambitious emission reduction goals. During today's debate, we'll discuss the benefits of C-V2X deployment in terms of emission reduction by 2050 in Europe, and we'll hear from TNO, a not-for-profit Dutch research institute presenting new research related to traffic efficiency and specific C-V2X functionalities that offer the best emission reductions. Join us online with hashtag EA Debate. Send your comments. Our social media team will reply to those. And also send us your questions for our panelists today as well using the Ask button as instructed at the very beginning. We'll put those questions and comments as well to our panelists a little later on. Let me just introduce our team today. We have Charlotte Nolan Mathiasen from the European Commission. Very welcome. Henna Verkunen, she's an MEP, and Geert de Hoek, he's Electricity and Energy Manager at Transport and Environment. Isabel Wilmik, she's a Senior Scientist at TNO. We'll hear from her in a presentation in just a moment. And Maxime Flamont, he's the Chief Technology Officer at 5GAA. Great to see you all. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. I'll ask each of our panelists to give us short introductory statements in a moment. For now, let me introduce Isabel. And Isabel will kick off today with the presentation. Isabel.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I will briefly present the results of the study that my colleagues and I conducted into the environmental benefits of connected mobility. Next slide, please. First of all, something about the approach of the study. The overall goal was to see how connected mobility can help to reduce emissions and with that help to achieve the target of a 90% reduction in transport emissions by 2050. Increased connectivity enables all sorts of promising use cases, not only for safety and throughput, as we are perhaps more used to, but also for reduced emissions. There were several elements to the study, literature research, we did interviews with stakeholders, and we added some, identified additional promising use cases by asking ourselves, so what do we see as emerging mobility concepts using C-V2X that are promising, and how can connectivity be used to address the inefficiencies in the transport systems? Other elements were looking at the potential emission reduction, figures of promising use cases, and the possible implementations with current and future communication technologies. Out of scope for this study were things like the electrification of the powertrain, vehicle downsizing or resizing, CO2 emissions stemming from the manufacturing of vehicles, the operation of digital and physical infrastructure, and the carbon footprint from 5G deployment. Next slide, please. On to the results. And first of all, with a table with the promising use cases that we identified and the impact mechanisms via which they affect emissions. This can be a reduction of the number of trips. It can be a reduction of the number of kilometers driven, a change in departure time, a shift to another mode of transport, a reduction of vehicle dynamics, or a change of powertrain operation. The blue use cases are the ones we found in literature. All use cases here actually are put in alphabetical order. To the use cases we found in literature, we then added the ones that emerged from the interviews, the ones in orange. The people that we interviewed had a shared view about the potentially large but still uncertain benefits due to modal shift, and a high potential for a scenario where all road users and traffic management systems are connected to each other to optimize traffic flow. This so-called everything connected to everything use case is a concept with numerous use cases, and the effect of such a scenario is then the combined effect of all these individual use cases. And finally, we added some use cases that emerged from asking ourselves, how the inefficiencies in the mobility system can be addressed, which yielded a few use cases that were not already in the list, the green ones in the previous slide, actually. So this complete list of promising use cases is quite a long list, and we can see that these use cases with connectivity focus for a large part on reducing vehicle dynamics, but there's also substantial potential in use cases that lead to a reduction of the kilometers driven or changing to a more sustainable mode of transport, or where perhaps some trips that are not strictly necessary are avoided. Working from home comes to mind because that's something that a lot of us have gained a lot of experience with this year. Next slide, please. Onto the quantitative impacts then. In this slide, the potential benefits as found in literature. Various use case categories are presented in a figure with the CO2 emissions reported for them, or the CO2 emission reductions reported for them. In the case of the light blue lines and dots, these are the effects given for all traffic that was regarded in the study. In the case of the green lines and dots, the effects are for individual vehicles that are equipped with a certain service, such as eco-driving advice. So the field trials and simulations reported in literature show that substantial benefits can be achieved. We do have to keep in mind, however, that this is often only in specific situations. An example of that is the Talavera study into CACC at lane closures, which showed a very large CO2 emission reduction potential for that specific situation. But if there are enough situations where emission reductions can be realized, the overall effect is, of course, also promising. In addition to looking at the literature for figures, we also did some calculations with our emission calculation tool, MPVer, using existing data sets from real-world trials or example speed patterns that we use to represent certain cases. Next slide, please. So first of all, these are indicative results, and the results presented here are valid only for the cases considered, and actually the same goes for the previous slide. If you want to scale up the effects, for instance, to all traffic in a city or even a whole country, you need to know the share of these use cases in the total mobility. So the first use case that we looked at in our emission calculations was cooperative adaptive cruise control and how it compares to ACC, with high resolution data from a field trial with platoons of passenger cars. This data set showed that making adaptive cruise control cooperative resulted in a 6% reduction of CO2 emissions. Second use case that we looked at was eco-driving on motorways. First of all, what if you can avoid driving in congested traffic? For instance, with real-time optimal route advice, shockwave damping systems, or safety systems that can prevent accidents that lead to congestion. That also showed an emission reduction potential of 6%. Or if you can drive at very constant speeds, more so than we can do today. This gave for different driving speeds reductions of 3 to 7%. And we looked at the potential of intelligent intersections. What if those can help reduce the numbers of stops that vehicles have to make? With measured truck data, the emission reduction potential was found to be 22%. For passenger cars, the estimations ranged from 13 to 21%, depending on the driving speed, or even up to 45% if the intersections are very close together and the cars have to stop often, like in dense urban networks. Next, please. Before we go to the conclusions, a few remarks about the possible C-V2X implementations. So existing communication technologies can already meet the requirements of many of the identified promising use cases in terms of bandwidth and latency. More advanced features, such as we can see on several technological roadmaps, could address requirements in terms of quality of service guarantees and massive equipment deployment. For the vehicle-to-vehicle, vehicle-to-infrastructure, and vehicle-to-network use cases and combinations of them, several possibilities exist using both short and or long-range communication. So some of these features are only planned at the moment, and whether all possible functionality will become available is not just a technical question, but also, among others, a business case question. And the same applies for deployment possibilities. We have to see whether all will become available. Next slide, please. And so we arrive at the general conclusions. As you have seen, there are many promising use cases, and real-world pilots and simulation studies have shown the potential to reduce emissions. Effect sizes found were in the order of 5 to 20%, as found in literature and also in our own indicative emissions calculations. This comes mainly from services helping to avoid stops and reduce driving dynamics of individual vehicles, as well as from services helping to optimize traffic flows. A high reduction potential was identified for the everything is connected to everything scenario, where services are bundled to help optimize each part of a trip, from eco-driving advice, which is useful in low-density traffic, to merging assistance, which can help in high-density traffic. So many services were originally designed for other purposes, for instance, safety or throughput, and emission reduction potential of these services can be optimized further by tuning algorithms and parameters specifically for emission and energy use reduction. Additionally, there is much potential in services like MaaS, where you can achieve a shift to more sustainable modes, or shared mobility services. We have to note that the results presented here are only for specific situations and also penetration rates. We don't have emission reduction figures yet for an everything is connected to everything scenario. Also, we have to take into account that there may be rebound effects if we improve traffic efficiency, like more or longer trips. And effect sizes may be smaller for future vehicle fleets, of which we don't know yet how they will turn out. And there are some aspects that we did not consider, as already mentioned. So finally, we need to look at the business cases that are possible for the promising use cases, because making the technology work is not enough. We have to make it work on the road, in the whole mobility system, and with the different stakeholders involved. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Great introduction to the topic today. We'll come back and look at some of this in a little more detail in a few minutes. Let's go to our other panelists for the short introductory speeches as well, the keynote content. So Charlotte Nolan-Mathias from the European Commission, your introduction. Need to unmute, I think, Charlotte.
I think it must be better now. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect now. Thank you.
So I wanted to thank TNO for this interesting study, which indeed brings new elements and interesting data to this subject, which is only in its beginning. And I think we had in some discussions around it with the impact assessment last year around CTS, and then there was recently also the European Parliament study, which I found quite interesting. And I think one thing that I'm from the TNO study, which I found particularly interesting, is the traffic level impacts, let's say. So the fact that you have the vehicle level emission reduction impact, and then the traffic emission reduction level. And I think this traffic emission reductions will really be what will be able to have the highest impact when you consider it in the light of parallel initiatives and legislation, CO2 emission performance on alternative fuel, infrastructure directive, under air quality. So I think when you take it in this context, and that will be reduced their CO2 emissions, I think the traffic level impact will be especially relevant. Now, maybe also just to quickly take a step back and underline really how these type of technologies like CRTS, C-V2X, but also MAS, as was mentioned, really can have a positive impact not only on, let's say, decarbonization of transport, but especially safety, security, and the economy. And I think we should not, of course, this event is really to focus on the emissions reductions possibilities, but we shouldn't forget the let's say, objective of these technologies. When you take, for example, the economy, the congestion costs, cost the EU economy today 1% in excess of the GDP, which is huge when you take it in comparison to the EU budget. But maybe to finish, just a couple of words, I think what everyone is expecting on what the Commission is coming up with in the area of data, especially because I think for these technologies to really have an impact on emission reductions, data is key. And so we need to make sure that data availability and interoperability and sharing is the best, let's say, and everywhere in the EU. So we need clear rules on the rights and obligations to collect and share data. And for that, there's, of course, the Data Governance or Data Act coming out this week. And then we will also have to look at the revision of the ITS next year, which includes, for example, multimodal information services delegated acts. And we will be able to make the landscape better for data sharing. When it comes to availability of data, I think here the Real-Time Travel Information Delegated Act will be very timely, and the revision is coming up. And the same will be needed in the context of urban vehicle access regulations, where the capacity availability of data is essential. Now, all this, of course, fits into the broader European common mobility data space, which has been announced already with the data strategy, but will be further developed in our upcoming strategy. Then it's not an issue, the data topic. We need to complete the framework on approval for connected and cooperative mobility. We also need to make sure that everything is tested and before we can really to the roads. And for that, we of course have the CCAM platform, which now will be transformed into a proper research and innovation partnership. And then we also have the JRC, who has a living lab on future mobility solutions. And I invite who's working in this field to participate in the call of expression of interest, which is still open until the end of the year, so 31st of December. So I'm finishing here. Sorry.
Thank you, Charlotte. Okay, you preempted about 25 of my questions, so you got that out of the way. Thank you so much. That was a great overview, and a lot of the topics we want to talk about today clearly laid out there as well. Let me move to Henna. Henna Virkunen, member of the European Parliament. Your introductory remarks.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this invitation. I think this is a very important topic we are discussing today, because we know that there is a pressing need in Europe to make transport more safe and clean and sustainable and multimodal and more efficient also. And I think that digitalisation and automatization and connectivity offer great opportunities for that. And they can boost the competitiveness of European industry, as well as contribute towards reaching the aims of the European Green Deal. Because as we know, transport sector is the only sector where the emissions, they have been increasing all the time. And before the pandemic, it was estimated that the passenger transport will grow more than 40% by 2050 compared to 2010. So we can say that how big challenges we are facing. Of course, as a result of the pandemic, these estimates, they may change, and the modes of transport may also, they may not be the same as we anticipated, but the increasing need for mobility and transport, they will remain, I think. So I see the pandemic as a temporary bump that will certainly change the trajectories in this field, but not the big picture itself. I think that the need for mobility, and therefore the significance, smart mobility and digitalisation, they are increasing in importance also in post-pandemic world. And I think that to enable us to meet the demands of both increased mobility and climate neutrality, we need to take full advantage of those technologies which can help us in reaching these goals. Vehicle-to-everything and cellular vehicle-to-everything, they are great examples of this, and I look very much forward to our discussion today. It's often underlined that how big opportunities these new technologies they are giving for us to make transport more safe. But as we heard, we can also cut emissions very much with all these technologies and digitalization. So I think it will play a big part now when we are seeking all possible solutions, how we can cut the emissions in transport sector. So I think digitalization, it will be one of the keys, because we can have so much more efficient transport system when we are using these new technologies.
Thank you, Henna. Great to have you with us today as well. Geert Cook, your introductory remarks, sir.
Thank you. So one of the, so maybe first the European Parliament and the European Commission don't need an introduction, but maybe TNE does. So we're Transport and Environment. We're a clean transport campaigning organization focusing on better air quality and also decarbonization of transport. One of the, I would like to share two reports with you. One is one of our sort of underappreciated reports. It's called Less is More, which talks about the three revolutions that are happening in transport. It's on the one, first, it's autonomous and connected vehicles. Secondly, it's electrification of vehicles. And third, it's shared mobility and sort of the new mobility forms that we're seeing with Uber sharing apps and ride-sharing platforms. So this is the third revolution. And as TNE, we wanted to add a fourth R after those three revolutions. The fourth R is actually urban planning and policy. So this is absolutely crucial, because what we've seen is that actually some of these ride-sharing platforms actually increase traffic and do not decrease traffic, leading to more kilometers driven and to increasing emissions, increasing congestion. So this is technology is great, but it needs to be accompanied by policy, and we need reduced space for cars in cities, a modal shift to walking and cycling, particularly in urban areas. So I think this is absolutely crucial. And we've in the report we show how if you just leave, for example, ride-sharing platforms uncontrolled into cities, it actually leads to an increase in emissions rather than a decrease in emissions, because you have a lot of automated vehicles running around empty and luring passengers from public transport. So policy is key, and this is absolutely crucial. Then, I mean, on to one of those key revolutions that I wanted to address is, of course, also electrification. And this brings us a bit closer to the topic today of vehicle-to-vehicle communication or vehicle-to-infrastructure. As TNE, we've published a report that's called Batteries on Wheels, and we mainly look at vehicle-to-grid, so smart charging and vehicle-to-grid. How do we make sure that we charge the vehicles in the electric vehicles, which are rapidly increasing their share in the fleet? How do we charge them in the most opportune way that matches a growing share of renewables, and there's a lot of flexibility potential there, because electric vehicles, or most vehicles, actually sit still most of the time. And so we want to also use these vehicles, which are essentially batteries on wheels, that's how we see them, to also help manage with growing shares of wind and solar on the grid, and to avoid that everybody plugs in the evening when peak demand is already, at its peak, is high. So we see, with smart charging of vehicles, we see three major benefits. We see less investment in grid capacity, so you don't need to upgrade the grids to meet that peak in demand in the early evening or in the early morning. And that can run into the €1 billion for a large member state annually that is not have to be invested in upgrading the grid. Secondly, you can reduce curtailment of renewables. So, at midday, when you have a lot of PV production available, photovoltaics production available, then you can charge that renewable energy in your vehicle and increase the share of renewables on the grid. And as a result, you help to decarbonize the transport sector, because it also lowers the carbon footprint of the electricity grid. So these are some of the major advantages that we see in vehicle-to-grid applications and smart charging of electric vehicles. So there's a couple of things that are obviously needed for this. We need to roll out smart charging infrastructure, both at home and in the workplace. So we need smart meters able to respond to, for example, to price signals. Those price signals need to be provided by a revised market design for electricity markets. So we need time of use pricing so that consumers can respond and charge their cars when the electricity is more cheap. And last but not least, it was mentioned, we need data access. So the state of charge of the battery, that is crucial information. And also all these data need to be interoperable. So those were some of the observations that I wanted to share from these two reports that we published on the topic.
Good, thank you so much. And last but not least, Maxime Flamand, your introductory remarks, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Brian. So thank you. I'd like to start with a thank you to the European Union in terms of their incredible ambition for the green targets, and especially the emissions reductions. And we from 5GA, we really believe that there is a clear role to play from the connected vehicle, and especially in terms of digitalization of transport. So for us, digitalization of transport is a kind of tool that leads to smarter analysis and decisions. These decisions will clearly lead to cleaner mobility and efficiency gains. So why do we actually all want to do that? Is because connected vehicles are really deployed already today, and we have about 180 million around the world of vehicles that are already connected with some kind of connectivity to the mobile network, 3G, 4G, and eventually with 5G. We have to make sure that we use this connectivity for the benefits of the environment. Of course, it's not only about environment, and Charlotte mentioned it. It is also about safety and congestion. But for what it takes here in this discussion, we really want to focus on environment. And how is actually the connected mobility contributing to this? On one side, clearly we are increasing transport efficiency and the driving patterns. We are reducing congestion with the fuel consumption and the emissions, but also, and interesting also, Charlotte mentioned it, it's all about the traffic flow management, and the better also localized environmental control that connectivity can bring. And then further, the mobility as a service. Clearly, connectivity is important underlying technology that will enable mobility as a service and multimodal mobility. Now, all this, I think T&E mentioned it, is also has to be taken as a whole into a global trend of the industry. And the trends are connectivity, automation, shared mobility, and electrifications. These trends are not necessarily overlapping with each other, but they are together very important in terms of achieving these eventual goals that the European Union has set for us. And then finally, I'd like to also mention a bit of a personal note, is that, you know, as a citizen, I'm using my bike to go to work. I'm also sometimes driving my kids to work, to their school. I'm also using public transport. Now, the plumber and the different workers, they have to use their car and their vans to go to their interventions. And so what connectivity brings on top of that is this versatility, this seamless transport that everyone has the opportunity to get from A to B and contribute to the economy. But at the same time, connectivity brings a lot of things in terms of emission safety. So all these is important to combine, and the combination in general comes with more intelligence, and the connectivity brings it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxime. I think it's a nice way to round off, actually. The intelligence of this system and what it's going to look like 10, 15, 20 years from now is really the core of what we're talking about, in a sense. I was at the Geneva Auto Show last year as well, and many of the manufacturers that were presenting there were talking about the different, using the different modes of transport. It wasn't, you know, like Maxime said, when you leave your house, you have one objective and then you have two other objectives along the way. You know, and then we heard from Gert and as well, and Isabella talking about the business models and the connectivity of the grid as well. So we have a big jigsaw to put together here, Charlotte. Do you see, how do you see this play out in terms of deployment? You know, what does it take to deploy an intelligence system that we will use in real life and not something that just looks good on a strategy paper?
So many things. I think, as I mentioned, the first step, of course, is to make sure to test really and create a trust environment for these vehicles. And we do that in areas. There's several in Europe. We need to create more and more as well, because we need to test the environment in urban areas, of course, but it's only think of the peri-urban or even rural areas, because in those automated mobility can be very useful as well and connected. So for me, that's really the first step of deployment, and the second step goes on parallel, but timing-wise. And the other step of deployment is to ensure that there's a framework to allow the data to be shared and be interoperable throughout the EU, but on a larger scale globally.
Yeah, it's that interoperability. Gert, you focused a lot on the energy grid and the different dynamics of that as well. What needs to happen in terms of information sharing, interoperability for a smart system to work like this and to reduce emissions when it comes to energy supply?
So one of the things that I mentioned was indeed this issue around the state of charge, like to what extent will, for example, a utility or an aggregator know what is the state of charge of of an electric vehicle, and then you need to have the battery data, and that is very important. That is not just data that sits with the car manufacturer or with the EV driver, but that can be shared. I mean, on a obviously always the citizen needs to opt in to share the data, but at least that would be accessible in an interoperable way. And then so I think that's something that is under discussion in the battery regulation, that the manufacturers would have to disclose or be able to share the state of charge. So this is definitely something to be considered in the battery regulation that's upcoming. And otherwise, I think it's also down to the implementation of the market design rules, which were approved in the clean energy package. And there again, there's a lot of implementation that needs to happen around introducing, time-sensitive electricity pricing, flexible tariffs, so that it actually builds the business case for charging your car smartly, and not just plugging in and immediately charging the car, but making sure that you charge the car when it's most beneficial for the grid, and then coincidentally, it also so happens, definitely in a grid with a lot of renewables, that you charge when the grid is when the price is cheapest, when the renewables are available. So this is something that is those are two things that I can mention.
Okay, Isabel, in your study, we tend to have a compulsive behavior in terms of how, when we go to work, and maybe this is getting softer now, and our patterns of behavior and traffic flow is a big focus of what you did. Do you see how data and electricity use for the next generation of cars will change traffic flow, or how the energy model could be adapted to deal with traffic flow? What does your research tell you?
I'm not sure the research tells us very much about this yet, but I think if electric vehicles can also drive, if you would have an automated electric vehicle, for instance, if you could program it in such a way that it drives in the most efficient way, so very constant speeds, and if you can then interact with traffic management systems like traffic lights, and you can in some way prevent the vehicle from having to slow down and accelerate a lot, then that can certainly help to reduce energy use and indirectly emissions.
Maxime mentioned earlier that there is the safety side of this, which Charlotte mentioned too, but really we're focusing on the environmental adaptability of some of the same systems, and you pointed to this. So if we're looking at the adaptation of technology which already exists, perhaps it's been there for safety, you're talking about cruise control as well, what the speed that is optimized at a particular time is going to change through the day as well. It's impossible to achieve that without interoperable systems, isn't it?
Yeah,
Isabel?
I think so. Yeah, it would be very helpful if there was some kind of guidance as to what is the optimal way to, how can you optimize traffic flows such that individual vehicles can also drive in the most optimal ways.
And you talk about, what do you mean by intelligent intersections? One element is 45% reduction with cars as well. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, intelligent intersections, basically as they are now, they are traffic lights that can communicate with vehicles, or possibly also with other traffic lights. So they know more about traffic that is arriving at the intersection, and so they can optimize the green times for that, for instance. They can also, the traffic lights can be coordinated between the intersections, so like a green wave. And if vehicles know when the light will turn to red or green, they can adapt their speed profile in such a way that they don't have to come to a complete stop, for instance.
Okay, so again, impossible for people to do this on their own. They really need an intelligent, smart system behind this as well. Charlotte, Hannah, I just want to ask you about, we have 90% reduction to get by 2050. It's a huge task. Is there any way that we can do that without maximizing every single avenue of opportunity? And Isabel pointing to some where you're only getting 6, maybe 7% reduction, but that 6 to 7% is going to add up to 90%, isn't it? Hannah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course, it's a huge challenge, and I think we really need multiple solutions that we can achieve this target. And I think all these new innovations and the examples we heard, they are very promising. So I think we, as the decision makers, it's very important that we are trying to create that kind of innovation-friendly regulatory framework that is boosting the innovations in Europe in this field. And I think now maybe the one most important legislation what we have to set is the access to data, because we know that data is preconditions for all these innovations. And in the same time, what we have to do also as a policymakers, I think we have to boost the investments to fast connections. I'm a little bit disappointed on that also, that how much we are lagging behind in Europe if we think about our connection targets in Europe. And now this COVID crisis, it has also meant a big step on digitalisation in all the areas. So there is need to very fast and good connections in all over the Europe. So I think how we can now boost these innovations and investments, it's really that we have to take care that we have good infrastructure, modern good infrastructure, and then we have innovation-friendly regulatory framework. But then a lot has to be done in the industry and also in the regional level, in city level, to make these possibilities to work. But in the same time, when I think that the innovations, they are very much made in the industries and in the regional level, we have to take care that we have to avoid fragmentation in the European market. So that's why we need a common framework anyway, and common standards, how these things are working, because we have single market here. But I think digitalisation is playing an important role when we are cutting emissions.
Yeah, and when we're cutting emissions, we've tried to incentivize in different areas with carbon reduction, and we penalize in some ways and we incentivize in others. Is it time that the same happen with data and with transport in this multimodal process that we're moving towards now as well? Do you see the need for some sort of green bonus for those who hold the data to share it, and to incentivize companies who are working in research and innovation, that they are incentivized as well with some sort of green bonus for the work that they're doing, because ultimately it has a larger public good as well? How do you see that in the Parliament?
We see that access to data, of course, it's really important for our innovations, and we think that also legislation is needed in this field. We can see that transport is one of the sectors where there has been quite much difficulties in sharing the important data which is needed for innovation. So we think that this governance regulation will play important part on this. But how to make these incentives working, I think it's a very good question, and we are working also on this field. But I think everybody will benefit so much on these innovations, so it should be clear that we have to share the data.
Any big ideas from the Parliament as to how this should happen, how it should be incentivized?
No, I don't have new tools for that. So I think we have to regulate it a little bit, that what kind of data has to be shared and how, because we know that the whole value chain should benefit on this data which is collected. And I think also we as consumers, so we should have also our word in this, because I think the people are also very interested in that how the data is used, because we are the ones who are all the time producing the data. So I think we should also have to say that how it should be used, because we know that we can have better services if we are sharing the data.
I think it's an interesting perspective, is that as consumers, we're also the producers of the data, and as public representatives, you're the representatives of those consumers and those citizens who own the data. There should be a stronger voice, perhaps, in that regard. Charlotte, the same approach. How do we incentivize, some kind of green bonus for this process to encourage interoperability, to promote research and innovation, and to also, I think it's useful to clarify the revolution, as Geert recalled. You need to have a focal point that people see they have a buy-in. How do you incentivize a green bonus with this?
It's a good question indeed. I think maybe another way to tackle it for to say that current you have first of all CEF, which will continue the Connecting Europe, continue to finance these such infrastructures and make sure that let's say, or the infrastructures for such connectivity is in place across Europe. You of course also have Horizon Europe and just to, well, Horizon 2020 is to start with, and the last batch of 2020 money was all about ways to incentivize the Green Deal, and that also went through infrastructure. So I think somehow, although it's not put as bluntly as you're able to do it, it is happening already. Now, how to boost it? Well, I want to turn to member states there and look, for example, at their resilience and recovery plans. And I think maybe a lot can be done through that. And I think using also the green what's the word? Contribution of connectivity could be a way, but there it's lobbying member states.
Thank you, Maxime. You talked about mobility as a service. How do you see that being unfolded in public policy, when most people would see mobility as something really held in the private sector?
Before we go into mobility as a service, I think that I can just come back on the previous comments, because I think it was very important. The first, well, indeed, connectivity is coming to the vehicles, that's for sure. What we have to make sure is that this connectivity is not only for downloading videos or these other funny stuff, but also to exchange the relevant data. There is a clear need for collaboration between the industry and the public authorities, and for these we want clearly to have that the vehicle manufacturers have an incentive to bring this connectivity, the right connectivity, to the vehicles. And so before talking about really the infrastructure and how we equip the roadside or whatever, what is important is to make sure that on one side you have the vehicle manufacturers that put the right technology on the vehicles, mobile network operators obviously that will then bring the coverage along the roads, as well as the different road authorities that would have to design or put the right interfaces with the right data to the vehicle manufacturers. And that is not always done perfectly, and so the collaboration is really needed. Now, does it need a green bonus like you're mentioning? Of course, if there is anything that could incentivize more connectivity in the car to the industry, that's always welcome, whether it's for mobile network operators as well as the vehicle manufacturers. So I'll stop
on that.
here.
Let me ask you, for example, if we go back to the safety context as well, we accept cars must have a certain standard of safety built into them, and if you don't have that, you don't get to play on the market. and nobody's going to buy your cars, and even if they're actually allowed on the road. So why is it different when it comes to the climate now? More people are going to die from climate change than they're going to die on the roads from car accidents, even if you took all the safety devices out. So why is this not something which is compelled, and should it be compelled within cars as well, so that this interoperable system, this C-V2X, is really a component of our global safety, if you want to put it in that context? Maxime.
So I'm pretty sure there are quite a lot of incentives for customers already today to buy a vehicle that is more efficient. Now, what we are trying to say, especially with this study, is that the connectivity brings a whole an overall important addition in terms of smart and intelligence of the vehicles and the whole transport. And so both in terms of safety, in terms of efficiency, and in terms of congestion. So what we want to bring here is that by digitalizing, by bringing more technology in the vehicle, and by connecting it, exchanging more data, you will put, let's say, one stone 10 ducks, if I can use that expression. And so that's one thing we really have to emphasize in the next strategy, is to make sure that things are connected, and especially vehicles.
Thank you. Charlotte, you have a comment to make?
Point. I think something which will help also to clarify, let's say, what is needed in terms of data is the revision of the real-time travel information services delegated acts, because there we will, for instance, look at how to which types of data sets are needed, and I think that's exactly what you're referring to, and whether it's the static ones, which dynamic data sets would be needed as well, and so in that way potentially expanding the scope of that delegated acts, and then I think next year we will also consider whether an initiative on access to car data would find its place. So these are already some frameworks that will help to incentivize and further verify the data.
Thank you. Please send in your questions. We'll put them to the panel as well. If you can tell us who you are, where you're from, that'll be useful too. If you have a specific question for a specific panelist, please include that in your questions. So please send those too. So lots of you online, I can see. And Hannah, data is something which we see as it is now and have some expectation where it's going to go in the future. But we have quantum computing on the horizon now as well. Artificial intelligence is not even beginning yet. There's a massive capacity for it beyond what we see on the table right now. And so, is our legislation fit to adapt, or are we going to be revising this again in 5 years to take benefit from what is technologically possible? Do you see the connectivity 5G era ready for the next generation, for disruptive technology?
Of course, now if we think about the Green Deal and the emissions, we know that now we are going to revise nearly all the legislations what we have set to 2030. So a lot of work has to be done again. And of course, this is also connected to transport sector, because like it was mentioned earlier, for example, now we have to revise also these emission targets for vehicles. And I think it's also important to develop the calculation methods, that how we are calculating the emissions, because now it's very much that we are just looking at what is coming out of the pipe of the car. But if we could have better calculation methods, that we could look the transport sector more as a whole, and also, for example, the connectivity of the vehicle and those possibilities with what it's giving for the whole transport system, because of the connectivity we will have more efficient transport system. I think we should also develop that kind of calculation methods when we are calculating the emissions and when we are setting the targets for the vehicles, because we have to do it now again. And of course, now we are going to do big investments to digitalisation, to 5G and artificial intelligence, like you said, and research and innovations. And I think all these are very much needed. But I think we can also, I think that we can expect that many smart mobility applications, that they will contribute to this seamless and multimodal mobility already in the short term. But I think that the full impact of them will only be realized in the long run anyway, since many of these applications, they need anyway a certain critical mass before they are becoming fully effective. So I think in the next 10 years, I think we will take big steps forward. But of course, in 2050, we should be climate neutral as a whole Europe. And I think before that, we will have a huge development on this sector, but step by step.
Okay, we're going to come with some questions in just a moment, but just before we do, Gert, you mentioned changing patterns of behavior, for example, autonomous vehicles empty, driving around the streets, and perhaps an oversupply of those as well. Do you favor looking closer at the consumer and pricing the activity of the consumer rather than the vehicle or even the electricity side of that? How do you see this behavioral model changing? Because if we put more vehicles on the streets, that isn't necessarily going to reduce emissions, even if they're more carbon neutral vehicles. So how do you see this in terms of consumer behavior?
Of course, it's
well, again, like the fourth.
Gert and Henna. Gert first, then Henna.
Okay. So obviously the fourth revolution I talked about is policy and urban planning. So obviously we need reduced space for cars in cities. There's a lot of best practices out there on how you promote more livable cities with that are less car centric. So there's a whole list that could happen. But what we've seen initially with the Uber experience is that you actually end up luring away people from public transport, more cars on the roads, more congestion, buses sit in traffic. And so this is something in traffic jams. So this is something that we
can price for that though, can't we? Because the data comes from consumers. The majority of it is on our phones. And we can determine where we're going and what type of mode of transport we're using. So if there's a premium to be paid for using Uber, for example, but an incentivized system to use public transport, and perhaps we build this into the tax code somehow, do you see consumer behavior changing that way, and the willingness of consumers to share their data so that they get perhaps cheaper transport as an outcome from that? Gert and Henna.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the pricing is obviously one of the key measures, and this is one thing that I would also like to add is that the incentivization to move towards electrification will also modernize the fleet, and we see that even with high sales of electric vehicles, you still have only a very small impact on the overall fleet. So accelerated electrification will also speed up the higher connectivity in the overall fleet. So this is also something that where the two things actually go very well together.
Okay, Henna, then Charlotte, please.
Yes, I think that because of these new technologies and digitalization, I think we will have much more smart and smooth transport system in the future. But of course, it will take some time. And also in some areas, we can see that how the consumer's behavior has already changed. And I think that when we will have the younger generation more moving actively, I think they have maybe a little bit different values. Maybe they don't want to own car, for example. So I very much believe into the concept of mobility as service. But of course, it's also need that we have to have a certain critical mass using these all services. And there's still some obstacles with free flow of data, and the services are not so maybe smooth and seamless than they could be. But I think that in next decades we will see a very big change on this consumers' behavior. And of course, all the cities and regions and member states, they are playing important role on that, because for example, taxation, it's something that the member states are deciding, and of course, what kind of decisions they are making on that, it's also having an impact, what kind of transport modes the consumers are choosing.
And you also think that cities perhaps are more responsive than countries or member states in this regard as well, and they have a clearer sense of what's possible within their district, and they can invest in that more quickly than perhaps the national government can deploy those resources. Do you see any examples of that in your own country?
Yes, of course. We can see, for example, in the capital of Finland, for example, the younger generation, normally they don't want to have driving licenses anymore. But here in the countryside, when I'm living, all the young people, when they are turning 18 years old, of course, they want to have driving license because there isn't so good possibilities for public transport, for example. So, of course, in the bigger cities, I think there's more opportunities to choose transport modes than in the countryside. But I think it's important that all the cities in Europe, they are really boosting this development on this field. And of course, also it's up the climate, for example, what kind of solutions you can have. Because, for example, here in Finland, our winters, they are quite cold, and so on, the distances are long. And we have a little bit different opportunities than, for example, city of Brussels is having when they are planning their urban transport system. But I think really that the cities and regions, they are playing important role in here. But at the same time, it's important that we take care that we don't have fragmented markets here, because often, anyway, the solutions, they have to work in our single market in the end.
Thank you. Charlotte?
Now I nearly lost the initial. What comes to my mind, at least, is that the Commission is also currently looking into how to facilitate multimodal platforms. So we see the beginning of such multimodal platforms. I don't know, to mention one, you have a CD Mapper, where you're able to find the best routes with different types of modes in public transport or mobility. It's of course especially in urban environments. The next step is that we need to look how to extend ticketing also onto these platforms, as ticketing is today managed mostly by the different types of operators, and by allowing ticketing also to be managed by a more multimodal platform, it will help citizens to make more effective routes and choices. Also, notably, the most, let's say, CO2 efficient routes, which is another aspect we're looking into, is how can CO2 efficient routes be calculated, and how can you choose whether you want the fastest routes, the most less polluting route. There must be other types of options, but so I think these multimodal platforms will be a big puzzle of the future transport system, at least in urban mobilities.
Thank you, Charlotte. We have a question from Miha Sirka, and Miha asks, how can C-V2X help to increase the modal shift as an essential tool for reducing emissions? Maxime, how can C-V2X help to increase the modal shift as an essential tool for reducing emissions?
So, I mean, C-V2X, so the word C-V2X for cellular V2X is combining two modes of communication, one way which is short range and the other one that is the connectivity to the mobile network. Now, in terms of the shift to other modes of transport, it is obvious that if you have if you are in a shared vehicle and then and you come from your origin, you want to go to in town, and then you know that a bus is actually scheduled, and it is actually in real time telling you that if you find a parking there where there is space, by the way, because it's connected, and then so you find a parking space, you have the time to just jump on the bus and then eventually go in the center of the town. If you make sure that all these steps that brings you in the bus are digitalized and available to you to make the decision, clearly that's what C-V2X brings into the car, whether it's a shared vehicle or whether it's obviously your own vehicle. That depends. But so that's how we want to use connectivity for the better good.
I thought it was interesting what Charlotte mentioned also about the capacity to choose. Do you want the fastest route, or do you want the less polluting route as well? And that while we may assume that the intelligent systems will make those choices for us, clearly we have our own daily preferences, or what would be our profile default as well. You may choose always to go for the less polluting route as well. And curious to see how that is monetized in the future as well. We have another question. Isabel, this one's for you. Why did the study focus on C-V2X only and not ITS 5G as a driver for reducing transport emissions?
Well, actually, we didn't really make a distinction. So for us, all communication systems are interesting. As long as you have connectivity, we wanted to see what you could do with it. So how you could, yeah.
I think we have another question from Florian. Which collaboration between industry and public authorities is needed? And are there examples of first steps? Nice broad question. Charlotte?
Industry and public authorities, well, there's of course the CCAM platform, which is a public-private initiative, which is a proper partnership, EU partnership under Horizon Europe.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that? No.
Yeah,
okay,
well,
Florian. Yeah, go ahead.
I think, Brian, in terms of partnership, I think that there is one kind of partnership that is then looking, of course, for funded activities, etc. But what we are looking really for at this stage is not to wait 10 more years until the technology is ready. We want to deploy things that are already there. And in order to do that, we need a good partnership with different entities. I mentioned the road operators earlier. I could have mentioned also the regulators in general that should be there in order to put a level playing field in order to make sure that the right technology can be deployed as fast as possible. So there are different elements, and whether it's public or private, everyone has to its role to play.
Okay, thank you. Just leading on from that, Hannah and then Geert, I think just quick answers in this. What does it mean to be connected to everything? This would seem like an obvious question, but it's really not, I think. And is there a timeline by which this will be reached with regard to deployment? So I think it's in the context of the Internet of Things, Hannah. What does it mean in policy terms, really, for everything to be connected to everything? Is that possible? And do you see a point at which we will say that's really the case, so it's been deployed?
Yeah, I think it will be the case in the future, hopefully, that everything will be connected to everything, that we will have that kind of Internet of things in the future. But of course, it means for example, very big challenges also already now, but also in the future if we think about the field of cybersecurity, for example. But in transport sector, for example, I think we will have huge benefits if we have that kind of system, that everything is connected, that our vehicles, they are really connected, the whole logistical system, and everything what is there around, because we can have so much more safety and seamless and smooth transport system because of that. And also earlier it was asked that what kind of cooperation is needed between industry and the public authorities, and of course I think it's crucial for all this development, because the public authorities anyway, they are enabling these new innovations. And for example, when we are doing urban planning in the cities, it's very important the industries and the stakeholders are there with when we are doing the plans, that we can really use the new innovations and take them account. And also in the national level, in member states level, or in the European level, it's important that we are listening all the stakeholders and we have very good cooperation here, because we should really have that kind of framework in European level and member states level that encourages new innovations. And like it was mentioned before, it's important that we are technology neutral here, that politicians, we shouldn't choose the winners and losers. We should have very technology neutral approach and level playing field for new innovations.
Thank you. Gert, the same kind of approach to the Internet of Things. I was, again, at the Geneva Motor Show, I was sitting in a German luxury car, which would brand and rim private. So your heart rate was measured, your blood pressure was checked, your tiredness levels according to your eye response was all measured as well. When we talk about connective wearable tech, we're not usually talking about wearing a car. Are we going to go far beyond simply making things work on the road and reducing our carbon emissions? This is going to be second nature to us?
Well, one thing that's about the future is that it's hard to predict. So I definitely, when it comes to fast-moving technology, I will not, sort of make very firm predictions. I think one of the key things with all this connected to everything is to really ask the question: what's the benefit for the consumer? Like if you make it worthwhile, if it offers safety benefits, if it offers, economic benefits in terms of smart charging when prices are lower, I think the consumer will follow. So this is not a goal in itself. It has to serve a purpose, and if it's safety, cheaper electricity prices, reduced emissions, I think that's the key question.
Thank you. Just a quick question to Maxime, and then we've got to ask each of you for literally a 20-second wrap-up as we come to the end here. Maxime, is 5G the only technology that can do this joining of the dots?
So, yeah, well, I don't want to contradict Hannah, because I really think that tech neutral is important. Thanks for that. But from my point of view, indeed, if you just take the current mobile networks, 4G LTE, they don't scale up if you want to connect everything. And so that's the response that the experts are providing is actually related to 5G, and the introduction of 5G then really brings these additional capability to connect everything, and that's why 5G is necessary. 4G will be enough.
Thank you. Final comments, Isabel, your takeaway for today? 20 seconds.
I think there was this talk about quantum computing and AI, and that inspired me to think about, we are doing a lot of research in that area of AI, looking at how people make their choice for mode of transport, for instance. And I think we need to probably intensify that a bit more even.
Thank you. Charlotte, 20 seconds.
Well, I think it's about the 20 seconds about the mobility strategy that comes out on 9th December, and the Commission, we look forward to everyone's feedback, of course, there to be able to work on the upcoming initiatives over the next years.
Thank you. Hannah,
for a
20
European, for a European transport system as a vision. Sorry, that was the conclusion.
Thank you. Henna.
Yeah, my message is maybe more for us as a decision makers, that we should make sure that Europe is the place where new ideas and innovations can flourish, and we should be the world leader in smart, sustainable and multimodal mobility. So that is something that we as politicians, we should enable that our industry can do that.
Nice bit of ambition on Tuesday afternoon. Thank you. Gert, 20 seconds.
Yeah. So I would say that don't forget about the consumer or the citizen living in urban areas. Making sure it results in livable cities and in smart charging, which provides lots of economic benefits and sort of system benefits overall. So I would keep it's not a goal in itself. It's a tool to work towards other goals like reducing emissions and more livable cities.
Thank you. Last word, Maxime. 20 seconds.
Thank you. 20 seconds. So yeah, well, we all talked about connectivity, and that's for us obviously 5G is very important. And what we want to bring as message here is that connectivity can simultaneously contribute to many of the policy goals here on digitalisation of transport, on climate change, and also maintaining the global competitivity of Europe. So yes, if you want to bet on something in the vehicles, just make sure that they are connected. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all our audience. Thanks to our team here and Euractiv as well, Simona, Matea and Malta. And just to remind you, hashtag EA debates. You can continue to comment there, and we'll see which responses you get from the audience. We have a substantial audience online today, so thank you for your participation. Also, just to point out that we had a gender-balanced panel today, not something we take for granted. So thank you to our team for making sure that was the case. Thank you to all our panel, to Charlotte, Henna, Gert, Isabel, and Maxime. I'm Brian Maguire. Thank you.